I'd like to get started. Thank you all for attending for what is a particularly important subject in the minerals industry, and in particular now we have some lessons as we go forwards in terms of higher commodity prices and what is going to happen to productivity as we push higher production and higher profits. I'd like to just start by introducing myself, and if I could just share my screen, and I'll do that. And put it onto can you all see that? You don't need to answer. I presume that it's all right, Gugu. If you could just let me know if that's coming through all right.
Hi, Matt. We see the meeting request.
You don't see the presentation?
No. Can you just share the whole screen?
I'm going to stop share again,
okay.
And just give me 1 second, and won't be a second, and I'm just going to close down that and close down that. And I'm just going to share the screen again. Excuse me a second. Okay, can you see it this time?
We can.
And on to presentation mode?
Yes, we can see in presentation mode.
Okay, so I'm going to go straight into it. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along. I have got approximately 45 minutes of presentation though, with time at the end for further questions. But if you would like to ask questions as we go along, please feel free to do so. My credentials to present this talk: firstly, 40 years experience in the minerals industry, mining and exploration geologist. I've worked in mining. I've worked as a mining analyst on the stock exchange, as a researcher in the Chamber of Mines, and mainly as the credentials for talking about productivity and business improvement. I worked, firstly, my first job in productivity was as regional manager for business excellence for BHP, and that was for Africa and the Americas, where I was introduced to concepts such as the Six Sigma, to using networks, to maintenance, and to looking at various operations from a productivity point of view. Subsequent to that, I was appointed as head of productivity for BHP, and over a couple of years, I helped to transform the company itself, which, as you know, is a fairly large company, and improve their productivity. Also, I was head of capital allocation and business improvement for ArcelorMittal. Okay, this is the third in a series. It's the productivity in the minerals, second in the series, productivity in the minerals industry. The first one was decision analysis, and we're going to be talking about the economics of project development as well. If we look at the industry where it is today, it's weathered COVID-19 well, and it's pushing new highs in terms of market capitalization. This is an index that is covered by the mining.com, and there are quotes basically at March 2021, the industry market capitalization was 1.35 trillion. It's now sitting at 1.47 trillion by the latest measure, and that's in June 2021. That's in comparison. So if you want to look at the size of the industry as a whole, it's probably, you can double that to about $3 trillion. That compares to Apple's market capitalization, a single company, is 6 trillion, and to the total banking sector of about 9 trillion. If you look at the value per share, with the bottom one, which is probably more importantly than the upper one, on the right-hand side, that it's dominated by diversified companies like BHP, Rio Tinto, Anglo American, Gold being in second place, copper third, iron ore. But with lithium moving up the ladder, it's considerably in the last couple of years. PGMs also reflecting the much higher PGM prices, or palladium in particular prices that we've experienced recently. Potash, which are the big fertilizer producers mainly in Canada, and coal having moved down considerably from a couple of years ago. Why did I really get interested in productivity? I was mainly involved in developing large capital projects for BHP, and I wasn't doing the development of those projects. I was doing the governance of any project over $250 million. And I increasingly was concerned over a period of time that the parameters that we were using in our project financial evaluations were increasingly going down. So we were using lower productivities, we were using lower efficiencies, and that was reflected in the capital efficiency ratio of the projects, which as an average for the company had gone from about over 1. Now, as you know, the capital efficiency ratio is the ratio of the NPV of the project to the project capital. And so over 1 would mean that your NPV is equal to the project capital. And that ratio had gone down to about 0.3 for the company as a whole. When I started looking at productivity, I found some excellent statistics were being kept by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And this goes back to 2010, 2011, when I started looking at it, where Australian mining, and it's a pretty good proxy for global mining, had declined significantly in productivity between basically 1985, when it had gone up, to 2000, and over the period of the super cycle, it had halved. So that was 10 years ago. My interest in productivity has stayed. I've been involved in various exercises since then. And as you know, I was involved with helping to fix BHP's productivity. If I look at where the industry is today compared to where it was 10 years ago, firstly, it's vastly better than it was in 2000. We have become more productivity focused. However, we haven't got back to the peak that we were in 2000. We've embraced technology right across the value chain, all the way from exploration to production. Gender diversity has become part of the mining industry, and much, much, much for the better. And we've held on to the HSEC gains. Any of you remember what the safety record was like 20 years ago would know that it has vastly improved in the last 20 years. That has stood us in good stead in terms of how we've coped with COVID over the last 18 months or so. On this slide, I'll just leave you with a final comment from my ex-boss, Mike Henry, who's still with BHP. And he comments that population growth, we know that that's going to continue to grow. Decarbonization has become a major, major issue in the mining industry, with the intense focus on climate change as a part of the whole intense focus on ESG, and rising living standards. We know how commodities drive better living standards. And those three will drive increased demand for energy, metals, and fertilizers. And we know that. And that's why we're interested in productivity, because we need to know that the industry will stay healthy as we continue this growth path over the next 20 to 30 years. If we focus in a little bit on the more recent past, so on the left-hand side, I want to show you the iron ore price in red, and it's gone up. This is up till December last year. It's gone up even further, although it's showing a little bit of weakness now. And the multi-factor productivity index, which combines labor and capital. You can see that productivity tends to have an inverse relationship with price. And that is why I'm saying that it's quite possible that productivities will start dropping as the prices remain high or continue to test new highs. Will we take advantage of the price spike to give up our productivity gains, is what I'm suggesting, or will we hold on to those productivity gains? There is a concern that we will go back to the excesses that we saw during the super cycle, and in particular that rising inflation will drive those excesses. I'll just leave you with a quote at the bottom. We all know what the palladium price has done, but there are many other commodities that have been testing new highs over the last year. So let's turn to what is productivity. There tends to be a lot of confusion in the industry on what productivity actually is. It tends to be often confused with efficiency. Productivity is different. It's a measure, it's a ratio, and it's a ratio of outputs to inputs. And those outputs can be anything from production, cash, hours, to inputs could be anything from capital, energy, material, and people and hours. So when a nation or any sort of block achieves productivity growth, it's able to produce more goods and services from the same amount of inputs. In turn, the productivity efficiency drives higher real incomes, and it leads to long-term improvements in living standards. And that's the basic concept of productivity. Nations will measure productivity in terms of basically 5 areas. They call it multi-factor productivity, and it's a combination of capital, labor, energy, manufacturing, and services. And the acronym that they would use is KLEMS. The mining industry is a little bit different, and back in 10 years ago, we had to adapt a lot of other industry terms and concepts to the mining industry to actually be more effective in how we describe productivity. So how do we measure productivity? And I'm going to go into this in a little bit of detail. So firstly, mine planning. I'm going to cover that in a different webinar. It's a subject all of its own, and it requires a fair amount of in-depth analysis. Equipment is the area that's usually measured in terms of productivity. OEE is the standard equation for measuring productivity, and I will introduce the concept of perfect day production. In terms of people productivity, it's really just production per labor unit. Now that production, as I said earlier, could be anything: output in terms of tons, output in terms of metal, output in terms of cash flow, divided by person. And that's I've called labor unit. Production needs to be measured in terms of an equivalent unit, and I'll show you how to work out equivalence. And you do need to adjust for the many different people that we employ in the mining industry, whether it's full-time, part-time, different labor rosters, contractors, consultants, etc. Supply productivity, we're not going to cover today. Capital projects, we're also not going to cover today. So I'm going to focus on firstly equipment and secondly on people, in fact the other way around. So how do we measure people productivity? Now, productivity does have a bad name because you mention productivity and immediately people turn to headcount reduction. It's not necessarily headcount reduction. In fact, it quite often isn't. It's making sure that we get more out of the same headcount, so the same resources, as much as making sure that those resources are correctly allocated. So production can be measured. There are many measures of production. It can be material mined, it can be material moved, underground and open cast. It could be the prime material. So in other words, is it just the material that you're moving which has directly applicable to that particular operation, or do you take rehandle into account? So there are many, many different ways of measuring it. The key thing is, though, to have everything comparable, and when you're comparing apples, to compare apples with apples. For production output, you often need to convert to a common equivalent, and this is for, let's say, a single company producing more than one commodity, or if you want to compare across companies, or if you want to compare across an industry. Common production equivalent measures are copper equivalents, in the oil industry, the barrel of oil equivalent, which is on energy. Platinum equivalent is a common one, a gold equivalent. Steel making material equivalent, which is an interesting one, which is based on how many tons of iron ore, manganese, and metallurgical coal do you need to make a ton of steel. Most equivalence calculations, except for that last one that I mentioned, are based on price. And it's important when you're doing an equivalent is to base it on long-term prices, long-term consensus prices, or just long-term, your own estimate of long-term prices, not on current spot prices. Sorry, also going back, the barrels of oil equivalent is also not a price measure, and that's based on energy equivalent. There are many others. I've seen equivalent calculations based on how much of each metal you need to make an electric car, for example, or how much of each metal you need to make a 1 million person city, for example. So it's used quite often, but as I say, these are the common ones. Copper equivalents tend to be the most common equivalent that we use. So how do we work out rosters? Now, there are many rosters, and what you have to do is convert it all to a full-time equivalent. So on an equivalent hours basis. Now, that might not look a hell of a lot of hours if you have, I think the total number of hours in a year is 8760, and working hours would work out to anything from 2,200 hours up to about 2,900, maybe 3,000 hours in a year, depending on the roster that you're working. So you need to convert all the rosters that you have in your operation to a single full-time equivalent. And that's, I've just given you some examples of this. I can't remember where I got this example, but this would be fairly typical of a conversion scale to convert to full-time equivalents. So let's go to the next and the big area that I want to cover, which is equipment productivity. First and foremost, you need to take your calendar time, which is what I mentioned previously, and divide it up into various boxes. And this is called the time usage model. And it is a fundamental building block for measuring equipment productivity. The equation that we've got is availability, and I'll come back to that, times utilization, times rate of production, divided by unit time or perfect day time, times the quality. Now, quality is very seldom used in the mining industry, but it would be used in the OEE, overall equipment effectiveness equation, in many or most manufacturing industries. I'll give you an example where what quality is. For example, if you're making widgets and 3% of those widgets are defect and they have to be thrown out in the quality control process, you can imagine that your quality percentage would then be 97%, and that would be a fundamental part of your OEE. An example of quality in the mining industry would be, say, in an open pit operation where your trucks are tramming to the wrong destination. So let's say 3% of your trucks tram to ore instead of to waste, or the other way around. That would be a way of incorporating quality into your OEE equation. However, it is not usually used in the mining industry. So let's go to available time firstly. So that's your availability, and that is generally subdivided into the areas that you can see over there. And after available time, you have utilized time. Now, those boxes are all shown as equal size. That's not meant to imply that the amount of time is divided up equally. So generally, and if you want to say a rule of thumb for availabilities, now that is the time that that piece of equipment is available to actually do work. And availabilities would generally range from about 85 to 95%. Of that time, a certain amount of time is utilized, and that utilized time would generally also range from about 85 to 95%. And operating time would be the proportion of that utilized time that is actually effective operating time. So if we go to looking at those definitions in a little bit more detail. So availability is the proportion of calendar time equipment is physically available. Utilization, so when it's actually doing work. It's used for moving, processing any material. And please, I might be talking about mobile equipment a bit here, but it equally applies to a mill, to a ship loader, to a train loadout facility, or any bit of fixed or mobile equipment. And production rate is any material being handled by the equipment as measured by the rate. So let's say, and usually by unit time, usually by hour. So let's say a 777 truck is loading, say, 100 tons. Let's say it's making 3 loads. Let's say it's doing 300 to 400 tons per hour. That would be your production rate. So OEE can then be divided by the perfect day production. So now I'll get to perfect day production now, which is why it is such a powerful formula for measuring overall equipment effectiveness. You can firstly, by dividing by perfect day production, you can then combine it with other productivity measures. And it then allows the metric to be scalable. So it can refer to a single item of equipment or to a fleet, or it can be aggregated. So for example, in BHP, I managed to aggregate equipment OEE to a single number for BHP as a whole across all of the mining operations, the smelters, the refineries, and all of the processing plants to a single number for OEE for the company as a whole, which was enormously useful. Okay, let's move on. Setting the perfect day. What is the perfect day? It's not the equipment, let's call it the rating or design. It's actually what you can produce out of that equipment. Now, one way of looking at it is to say, well, what has been our best performance in a previous example, like the previous 12 months? This is an example from actually from MMG, I think, where they show how they actually estimated perfect day production. They looked at just the peak in the previous 30 days, and they used that to estimate their perfect day production. So it is when everything goes right, when you've got the right all been fed at the right time, and maintenance is all scheduled, not unscheduled, and you can actually estimate that or work out what went right and try and replicate it going forward. Very, very powerful concept, and one that is very underutilized in the mining industry. Critical thing though is you can do across the board analysis of productivity, but it's not going to help you much unless you know what your bottleneck is. If you know what your bottleneck is, you can then focus on understanding how to relieve that bottleneck. Now, it's a bit like the game Whack-A-Mole. I'm sure you've seen it, where you hit a mole on the head and it goes back into kids' game, it goes back into its hole and another one comes out, and the more you hit, the more they come out and the faster. Now, it's a bit like that with productivity. Relieving a bottleneck in one particular area might just transfer that bottleneck to another area. Unintended consequences do happen. So you've got to be aware of what's going to happen if you fix your productivity here, or if you relieve your bottleneck here. You might actually just transfer that bottleneck somewhere else, and that unintended consequences could mean that your bottlenecks are actually worse in the new area. So a clear analysis of theory of constraints is critical to any productivity analysis. Theory of constraints is also very much intimately involved in understanding change. So the 3 questions to ask in any change management is, what do you want to change? What do you want? What is your future state? And what are the processes that you're going to use to affect that change? Now, concepts or techniques such as Six Sigma are enormously beneficial in the mining industry to help cause the change. So they help you measure and they help you actually affect the change. However, Six Sigma alone does not an overall productivity improvement process. You need to combine it with other aspects of productivity improvement. This is a critical part of the productivity improvement journey as well, is to understand that any performance, any metric is a distribution. And if you focus just on improving the mean, you may be neglecting, and usually are, the fact that your distribution needs to change. So you not just have to improve the mean, you actually have to narrow the distribution. You need to narrow the spread. And one way of doing this is by creating league tables. Let's say you have a fleet of 20 trucks. Each truck will have its own availability, its own utilization, and its own rate of loading. And by creating distributions, you can actually figure out how broad those distributions are and then focus on the lower end to get it to the upper end. Now, you've got to focus on both, because if you have a look at the upper end, you can figure out what they are doing well and then apply to the ones at the lower end of your league table. And that's the concept of no man left behind. And benchmarking. Critically, people like to say we cannot benchmark because we are different. Now, that I don't buy. You need to benchmark on raw figures, whether those trucks are mining at 5,000 meters in the Andes, or they're mining in South Africa, or they're moving dirt in Queensland. You need to focus first and foremost on the raw figures. The minute you start applying factors to, and they're called environmental factors, to your fleet or your ship loaders or any piece of equipment, you tend to focus on those factors rather than on the raw data. It goes back to the old gold mining site in South Africa, where the mine call factor became the king. And we didn't focus on what was the real reason for having a low mine call factor. We focused on the mine call factor itself. Change management. So this is a sweeping statement, but one that I fully believe in. Productivity improvement will fail without effective change management. No one likes to change. Often the reason for poor productivity is the culture, and it's often because a company doesn't have the proper vision, it's not values driven, and you will not get a productivity improvement program right unless you have those in place. You've also got to start at the top. Backing of senior management is critical to success of productivity improvement. And you've got to involve every layer, from the CEO to the shop floor. I developed a concept which I called the golden thread, which was how to link the productivity on the shop floor to shareholder value. And it's amazing how it can actually work. And using those OEE equations, and using the concept of perfect day, you can actually link it. And that's why you have to have everyone in the company involved in productivity improvement. The other one is you've got to make the rational and emotional case together. So the rational case, yes, shareholders will get more money out of it if I work better. But the emotional case is, what's in it for me? How will I have a better quality of life if I work better productivity? I remember talking to a crowd of maintenance personnel doing truck maintenance, and I said, there's a concept called tool time. It's a metric on how much time a maintenance engineer will actually spend on fixing that actual machine, and how much they will spend on doing other stuff. And the average for that team was 25% tool time. And I said to them, well, the reason why you're maintenance engineers is because you like doing what you do. Isn't that true? And they said, yes. And I said, well, why do you only like doing it 25% of the time? And why do you like not doing it 75% of the time? And they thought about that for a while, and they eventually came back to me and said, but because we can, because no one wants us to do it any better. No one says, well done if we do more than 25%. It had nothing to do with money or pay. It was all to do with recognition. And that is the key thing in productivity, is to recognize success and celebrate wins, and make sure that you're celebrating those wins openly and with visibility to everyone in the company. One of the things that I did was to, twice a year, I would get the 2 top productivity performers, individuals who had led significant change in the company, and got them to present to the full board, usually London or Melbourne. And it was amazing how that celebration of success actually transformed the way that people looked at productivity. Everyone wanted to be that person who was going out and buying a new suit to go and present to the board. And also the consistent engagement. I cannot overestimate that enough. You have to consistently talk to people all the time about productivity improvement. So we are getting close to the end of the formal part of the talk. This is an example of the productivity improvement that I led. The size of the prize is huge. I could not believe how much additional cash flow could be achieved by better productivity. When I started looking at it, okay, it's a large company. The company itself had something like 1,000 ultra-class trucks operating throughout the world, all the way from Escondido to Arizona to South Africa to Australia and other places. And when I looked at just a simple back of the matchbox calculation, I said, if we improve our productivity by just a small amount, we can park 300 of those trucks. I didn't believe my own calculations. I then worked out the size of the prize in terms of how much did that translate into in terms of increased cash flow. And I also didn't believe my own calculations. In fact, the noise got to the chairman of the board, who called me in and said, I believe you making noises about productivity. And I said, yes. And he said, what's the size of the prize? And I think at that time I told him something like $7 billion. And he said, I don't believe you. Well, the proof of the pudding was that the size of the prize was 14, was double that. And I can demonstrate that with any company. Now, please remember that a company that's operating at very good levels of productivity right now will have a much smaller incremental free cash flow benefit, which I call the productivity benefit, than a company which is operating at very low levels of productivity, which is what this particular company was doing in 2012, which was the baseline. So just saying, success factors for productivity, these are really generic. You've got to establish your baseline. You've got to establish the size of the prize, in other words, what you're aiming for, and you have to establish a common language. How do you measure productivity, and how do you manage it? You've got to establish the metrics and the hierarchy of metrics. So I developed a metrics called M1, M2, and M3 metrics, and that was a hierarchy of metrics. So you could just put all of your metrics into a box and get hundreds of them throughout any company and pull them out at will, as I've seen monthly management reports with pages and pages and pages of metrics without any idea of what the hierarchy of metrics is. So of my M1 metrics, which were the key metrics that we used to drive productivity, there were only 10. There were 10 metrics, M1 metrics, covering equipment, people, supply, capital projects, and marketing. And then there were about 100 M2 metrics, covering equipment and people, productivity, and other areas. So you've got to combine, as I said, the technical measurements with the strong change management program. I made the mistake when I set out on this particular journey of thinking that it was all technical. And I really had to eat my words, because at the end of the day, it was probably 60 to 70% change management, convincing people that it was the right thing to do. spending time with people, spending time actually showing them how it could be done better. The other thing is, in a larger company, you will have a head office or central office, whatever you want to call it, and you will have operations. Many companies don't establish the role. Is the role of the center to set and manage standards, in other words, governance, or is it an internal consultancy, or is it a combination of both? Many companies that I've worked for and with haven't really clearly sorted that out. The rules of engagement between the center and the operations needs to be clearly stated. Many companies have, I have to admit. Management support for the change, you might as well not start on it unless senior management right to the top actually supports what you're doing, because you are going to ruffle feathers. And when you ruffle feathers, there are going to be complaints, and you need senior management to back you before those complaints even arrive at his desk. And then celebrating success. I mentioned a couple of things that you do, and consistent messaging. Productivity, as Andrew McKenzie said at the time, has the ability to add more value than anything else we do. And that's true. If you are a company running at a low level of productivity and you fix it, you can actually create more value than any project that you actually might think of doing in terms of overall return on your investment and in terms of absolute value of return. So this is an example as well from this was a gold mine that I looked at, and these numbers for those of you in South Africa would be fairly familiar with these sort of numbers. So what I looked at is a 5% improvement in productivity in underground mining. It translated to a 14% improvement in revenue. And that is incredibly significant. The multiplier effect of productivity with no labor increase, remember, but attracting all the additional costs that you might have in mining more ore underground is significant. So 5% improvement in productivity translates to 14% improvement in overall revenue, or overall operating profit, sorry, not revenue. And I think we could do that example in many, many operations, smelters, refineries, etc. around the world, and I think we'd find the same multiplier effect. So let's just finish off here, and then we've got a couple of minutes for questions as well. The industry has largely got it when it comes to productivity. If I look at annual reports, if I look at the conversations that go on about productivity, they've become commonplace. However, there still is no common place that you can go to have a look at productivity type of metrics. Such as in the airline industry, you can go to an annual report for the airline industry as a whole, and you've got metrics there coming out of your ears for every single operator in the industry. You cannot do that in the mining industry. You actually have to go and buy that information, usually from specialists who collect that information, or from consultants who give you back your own information at huge cost. So we still are, in that respect, an immature industry. But we have become a more efficient industry as a result of improvements in productivity. However, my warning right now is that we're running the risk of repeating some of the mistakes of the past unless we have built-in productivity and continuous improvement into our operating systems, so that we don't again chase growth at all costs as we've done in the past. So that brings me to the end of the formal part. Happy to turn it over for questions. If you do want to get hold of me, that's my email as well. And Camilla, I think we circulated the slides. I've given you the slides to circulate, which I'm happy for you to give to all registered attendees. I'm going to, if you're happy, stop the share of my screen and take questions. Sorry, it's not Camilla, it's Gugu. My apologies.
No problem, Matt.
Okay.
I'll also follow up with Camilla on that, and we will send the slides through to the delegates.
Okay, so I see the question from Cynthia. Will this presentation be made available? I think I've already answered that. Absolutely, you're welcome to it. And you're welcome to follow up with any further questions that you might have as well. You've got my email, and that will be circulated to you. Any further questions? I've got a question for you. Do you think that, from your experience, that the mining industry takes productivity seriously? Don't need to answer it, but just think about that. Do you have discussions on productivity at your operations or your exploration or whatever you're involved in? Hugo, if there are no further questions, I'm happy to say thank you. Sign off. Please get hold of me if there's anything else you'd like me to cover.
All right. Thank you very much, Matt. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's session. See you next time.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye.